Well, hey friends, welcome to week 1 of the Hebrews class. I'm Nike Spalding, and I have the privilege of being the resident theologian at St. Jude Oak Cliff, and I'm really excited actually to jump into this book of Hebrews. And so you'll hear me tonight. The big theme, I think, of Hebrews is Christ is greater, and we'll talk about that. But one of the big themes of tonight's lesson, and I think one of the sub-themes and pretty big themes of the entire book, is this idea of God has spoken. And you'll see what I mean as we jump into it. And so that's why I named this class Hebrews, God Has Spoken. And so you'll understand more as we jump into it. But of course, the goal of all Christian instruction is worship. And so take a moment. And if you're familiar with St. Jude, you'll know why I'm asking this question. But what's a piece of art? Maybe it's a song, a poem, a picture, like something in this world that when you encounter it, it helps you worship God better, or it inspires you to think of the Lord or His Word or something like that. Just take a moment, consider what makes you worship, and just spend some time either dialoguing with someone about it or just thanking God for good art, because we believe at St. Jude that all good art ultimately just rips off from God. He is the author and perfecter of beauty, and so so set your hearts right and then jump back in. So this is going to be a quick class. Now 5 weeks isn't exactly quick, but it will be relatively quick given that Hebrews is 13 chapters. And so I'll show you a little bit of how we're going to break it up. So tonight is background information, and then we'll talk about angels and Torah, which covers chapters 1 and 2. Then next week will be Moses in the Promised Land, 3 and 4, priests and Melchizedek, 5 and 7, sacrifice and covenant, 8 and 10. And on the last week, we'll really talk about the so what, which is really fun because I think the author of Hebrews kind of ends with a so what, which if you've heard me preach at all, you know I end with a so what. And so we'll talk about the so what. And then we'll do final projects in the class. So if you're doing this as a hybrid, you're kind of listening to these as you miss weeks or whatever, and you're thinking about like that final week, you don't have to come with the final project. We are going to do it together, in the class. And so, so it should be fun. So, like I said, tonight we're going to be talking about the background to Hebrews. When we say a background of a book, what we mean by that is answering the question sort of, who wrote it, who was it written to, when, where, why, what is it, what are we looking at here? And the reason why we do that is when I was in seminary, I learned about this study, and it's been so long, some of the details are foggy, but go with me here because I'm in the ballpark. But this study decided to take two groups of people, and they were both going to be studying a book of the Bible. I think it was Philippians. So this group was just given Philippians. It was like, here's the book of Philippians, go read it, and then we're going to give you a quiz. Then this group was given what we're talking about here, this background information. And then they, after getting the background information, then was sent away and they came back. And then they gave them both identical quizzes on the content of Philippians, not the who, what, when, where. It's not like they didn't have the information. It was just, hey, what's happening in chapter 2, what's happening in chapter 3, stuff like that. And the group that had the background information did, I believe, like 95% better, like some absurd number better than the other group, which reveals to us it's really important when you're tackling a new book of the Bible to have this information, because it kind of gives you placeholders. It helps make sense of maybe why would this author write it, and if they're writing it to these people and these people are going through this very difficult thing, like that helps make sense of maybe they say why we persevere and things like that. And so anytime I'm studying a new book of the Bible, I do two things. This is every time. I go to BibleProject.org and I watch the video about it, and that usually gives me a who, what, when, where, or what, and why. And then it gives me an outline. So I do that. They're anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes, super simple. And then I grab a commentary and I go to the introductory material, and every commentary, I think every commentary, maybe some don't, but almost all commentaries start with this information, because they know in order to fully understand what's going on in the letter, this information becomes incredibly helpful. It's like a tour guide. This is the metaphor that I use for it. It's sort of like you go to Rome, someone plops you down in Rome. Everywhere you look feels equally important because everything's old and it's amazing and it's exciting and all that and stuff. And so sometimes you need to be like, wait, I know that huge building is important because I saw it in the movie Gladiator, but what is it again? When was it built, right? And so you have a guide that says, hey, here's the Colosseum. Hey, here's the ruins of such and such. And so that's what tonight is. I'll be your tour guide to give you this background information. That being said, a little bit of a Hebrews disclaimer, okay? I'll read this to you. Philip Hughes has a commentary on Hebrews, and this is what he says, because I just told you I'm going to tell you the who, what, when, where, and why, and then you're going to laugh when you read this. But Philip says, it is true that the epistle to the Hebrews, and even that word epistle, that just a fancy word for letter, even that is debated. Is this a letter? Is this a sermon? Like, what is this thing that we call Hebrews? So even that's debated. But anyways, he says, it is true that the epistle to the Hebrews has been the battleground of discordant or different opinions and conjecture. We don't really know, but maybe, right? And so he's saying, look, hey, it's true. This letter is definitely a battleground for differences of opinion. And frankly, we don't know, but maybe, right? And its author is unknown. Its occasion is unstated. Its destination is disputed. He says, but these are matters of the periphery, not the heart of the book's importance. All are agreed on the intrinsic nobility of its doctrine. And I think you're going to see that tonight. So we're going to do the background info, and you're like, hey, you told me it was really important, and we're going to get to the end of the author, and we're still going to be like, we don't know. We'll know a little bit more as we get through the background information, but I think he's right, that when you read this book of Hebrews, you will agree with me on the intrinsic nobility of it. Truth be told, when we were doing the final four of what book we'd be studying, I was really hoping y'all would pick Philippians. Mostly because I was studying it for grad school, so it was going to make my job a little bit easier. It's shorter, it's only 4 chapters, so I thought, fit nicely into a 4-week study. But, happy to do what you guys asked for. And so as I began to study Hebrews, though, I was reminded, because I haven't really studied it in such a long time, and I was just reminded, like, wow, this letter, this homily, whatever we're going to call it, it's incredibly beautiful and encouraging. And so I think you'll agree with that. But all that to say, don't have expectations you're going to know all the who, what, when, where, and why. But I think you'll be encouraged when we get to the end of the 5th week. So, all right, so the who. When answering the who, when you're talking about background information, the 2 big who's that you're really trying to answer is who's the author and who are the recipients, and kind of what's going on with those 2 groups of people. So the author, we don't know. Okay, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. It's got some Pauline thoughts. Like, there are some things in this letter that you go, oh, that sounds like something Paul would say. But there's such a heavy Jewish emphasis in this letter. And for Paul, he's really the disciple to the Gentiles. He's the apostle to the Gentiles. So there are also areas where you're like, that's a weird departure from maybe how Paul would have said that. So early on, right? So one of the ways that we know who writes letters is either their names. I, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, am writing to you, the church of, whatever. We don't have anything like that in Hebrews. Hebrews just jumps right in. And so we don't have any sort of beginning material that tells us who wrote it. But we have church history. And church history often tells us, like, this is who we think wrote whatever letters we have. The West, so churches in the West, interestingly, knew it wasn't Paul. Like, they just knew it wasn't Paul. The East, though, thought it was Paul, and they would say so much as that, like Paul wrote Hebrews. And what's interesting is, if you guys remember in the Trinitarian class, when we talk about the controversy of Jesus and Jesus's God-manness, and you've got Athanasius going up against Arius and all that, so much of Hebrews is such a profound book of high Christology, of like this incredible book about Jesus, that Hebrews was used a lot, and because of that, then people wanted it to be attached to an apostle. So it was because of those controversies, actually, that the West then was like, okay, maybe Paul did write it, wink, wink, because we want to be able to use it rather than an anonymous letter. But probably Paul didn't write it. Almost all modern scholarship agrees Paul didn't write this letter. The person, though, that wrote it, they did know Timothy. So most likely they were in the circle that included Paul, Timothy, Silas, maybe Barnabas. And so this is a person familiar with the teachings of Paul at a minimum, if it's not Paul. And again, most modern scholarship just says this is probably not Paul. Theories, though, include Barnabas, the companion of Paul on his missionary tours. Apollos, if you remember, in the Church of Corinth. He's a gifted communicator. He's a gifted teacher. Some include Priscilla, which is Martin's favorite, that a woman wrote it, and perhaps because a woman wrote it is why it's anonymous. And even some people say, no, it was just a plurality of authors. That's why, multiple people had their hands in it, like a group of pastors got together and they wrote it all together. And there are a lot of we passages, which isn't completely unusual, even in letters that we know Paul wrote. He'll sometimes say we, because he's referring to, his companions and things like that. But this person knew the audience. That's what we can infer from the letter, that there is some familiarity there. So like when Paul's writing to the Romans, he doesn't know them yet. When he's writing to Corinth, he definitely knows them, like on a level that he like outwardly mocks them. And so whoever wrote Hebrews knows the Hebrew people, whoever the Hebrews are. And they're a very pastoral person, whoever wrote this letter. In fact, I keep saying letter, but it reads more like a sermon, and it's extremely pastoral, and it even ends in a so what, like I mentioned earlier, which I just frankly think is incredible. And so we don't know who. You'll hear me say he a lot. A lot of commentaries just call the author the pastor. Like they just say, well, the pastor said this and the pastor said that. So you'll hear me say that a lot as well. When we had the class, I said he, and Martin said she, and I said, you're right, it could be she. So we don't know. We don't know who wrote it, but we know that the person knew the audience, cared for the audience, and desired to lead them through a difficult circumstance, and we'll talk about that. The recipients, who are the recipients? Well, we can infer a lot about them, and a lot of the reason why we can infer that is based on how the author writes. So I gave this example. If I were to come up and just say to somebody, therefore, just like Bud, Barry, and Bob taught us, we trust in Brent because he emphasizes defense. So a hearty boomer to you all, and may your classic 50s flow always delight. And if I were to say, okay, what can you assume about the recipients of this phrase? What you can assume, if you don't know, is Bud, Barry, and Bob are the big-time coaches for OU football that have won championships. Brent Venables is our new guy. He's a defensive specialist that came on. I'm talking about football here, right? So Boomer Sooner, like that's coded language for people who understand OU football. Like everyone who's an OU football fan would immediately understand this. Classic 50s is this really famous drive-in on the main strip. You get a root beer float there. I mean, like, so you could work your way backwards from this phrase and say, okay, what we know then about the recipients is they're an OU fan, they're familiar with Norman, they're probably from Norman, they care about football, like things like that. And so that's what we do with the book of Hebrews is we work our way backwards and we make these inferences from them. But they're pretty good inferences. So some of the inferences we can make. These recipients, the reason why we call them the book of Hebrews is it's most likely a Jewish audience. I mean, like, not most likely. There's no way you can read this and not think Jewish audience. They have extensive knowledge of the Old Testament. How do I know that? It's because this person writes like this. They don't say, Coach Bud and Barry Switzer and Bob Stoops. Like, they don't need all the extra information. We know what you're talking about. We know what Boomer is. Like, we don't need the extra information. That's the who of the Hebrews. They just move through the Old Testament and assume you're tracking. So whoever the recipients are have extensive knowledge of it. They're wanting to return to cultic practices. And what I mean by cultic is not like, ooh, a cult, like, ooh. I mean like cultic as in like you participate in like the temple and these practices like sacrifice and things like that. That's just the theological term for cultic. They want to return. And so much of the letter of the Hebrews is you can't go back. There's nothing for you back there. But it implies that they came out of it. There's no Gentile believer that's coming up against hard times that says, okay, I want to go back to Judaism. No, they would say, oh, I want to go back to Zeus or Artemis or whatever. And so the fact that these people want to return to cultic practices and the pastor who's writing the letter says there's nothing for you there tells us that they are most likely Hebrews. Doesn't matter if they're Greco-Roman, doesn't matter if they're Jewish, they belong to an honor-shame culture because of the time that it was written, which is going to have an impact on how they go through what they're going through, which is persecution and imprisonment. So persecution and imprisonment is just bad. I don't have to convince you of that, right? Like the word persecution has a negative connotation. It's not a neutral word. It's a negative word. Sorry, it is hot in our office still, and we're working on getting the AC, but I'm starting to sweat. Persecution is just a negative thing. Imprisonment's obviously a negative thing. You add on top of that the honor-shame paradigm, where your persecution is not just bad because of what you're enduring, but the shame that you're now bringing to your community and to your family. This is a big deal, and it would be a major driving force as to why they would want to return to Judaism. Okay, and it is sometimes even hard for us to understand the pressure that an honor-shame culture person in an honor-shame culture would have to navigate. But That's the who. That's the recipients. The when. So 70 AD is a really big date in the New Testament era. And it's a big date when it comes to dating books. Like, is it before 70 or after 70 is a big question. And the reason why is that is when Titus, the Roman general, came in and took out the temple. Okay, so the temple gets destroyed in 70 AD. So when you're reading letters about that, that's a big event. Like, especially for Jewish people, like, oh my goodness, like the temple was amazing. Herod's temple was just unbelievably, extravagantly beautiful and amazing. And so if the book isn't talking about that, chances are it happened, like the book was written after that, because you wouldn't go through that event and not reference it, especially a book like Hebrews where it talks about cultic practices and sacrifice and things like that. Like, it would be like, hey, you guys want to return to sacrifice, but you can't because your temple's broken, and it doesn't say that. Which is why we most likely think it was before the fall of the temple, and so written before 70 AD. But it also has a very high Christology, and what I mean by that is it is not confused about who Jesus is. So sometimes the Gospels can write like Jesus is from the ground up, right? It's sort of like they're figuring out in real time who he is, and then it ends with exaltation. Hebrews starts at exaltation. And so because of that, it was most likely written later, not early 30s, 40s, as people are kind of going, wow, that was crazy. Like, what is it that he taught us? Yeah, what did you learn? Okay, how do we make sense of this? Like, most likely written in the 60s. And so some people say 65, 68, I don't know. Somewhere in the 60s, though. Okay, where? This is we don't know. Maybe Rome. Maybe Corinth, maybe the Lycus Valley, and the Lycus Valley is ancient Western Turkey, and includes like Laodicea, Colossae, and the reason why maybe the Lycus Valley is there was a large Jewish population in the Lycus Valley, so it would make sense that a letter could go there and reach a large Jewish population who had been evangelized already into Christianity and maybe were considering returning to Judaism. We don't know. And then what? Okay, so you've already heard me say, like, that guy, Philip Hughes' commentary calls it an epistle. So an epistle in the New Testament, you've probably seen this, right? They all start and kind of end the same way. Greetings, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to you all, grace and peace, blah, 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 right? And then it ends with, and here's a doxology, hope to see you soon, peace out. Hebrews is not like that. It just jumps right in. It's like, hey, long ago, in many ways, God has spoken. Like, it just jumps right in. But it ends like a letter. So it reads like a homily. Like, the whole first, 11 chapters reads like a sermon. And in fact, I encourage people from the first week, go in one sitting and read that whole thing. It's amazing. It's in a phenomenal sermon. It'd be long for modern day St. Jude standards. Not long for every church standard, certainly, but it's an incredible letter. It does end like a letter, though, sort of like these last things. So what a lot of people think it is probably a sermon that the pastor wrote, that they handed off to someone, and they expected them to read it out loud like a homily. And we've talked about this before. The letter carriers, they would have been taught how to perform the letter, who to look at, where to pause, how to have dramatic effect, right? So it reads like a sermon, and then at the end of it, just kind of a letter to address whatever things the pastor wants to address. So I'm going to say it's a homily. It's a sermon that was mailed. That's what I think it is. Okay, the why. I already mentioned this. There is persecution that is causing Christians to fall back. Some will fall back to their Greco-Roman way of life. These particular Christians want to fall back into Judaism. It's less shameful. It's less dangerous to be a Jew than it is to be a Christian, especially during this time period. The persecution under the Roman emperors, it's ratcheting up, and it's not safe. I don't even know why I did that. It's not safe to be a Christian. And I did like this at first because I was thinking socially it's not safe, but it's also physically and imperially not safe. And so there's so much pressure on them. And we talked about this already on this honor shame culture. Persecution So imagine you're a Jewish man and you go to the butcher shop and there's a Jewish man named Ishmael who you've been buying your butcher cuts from for years. And the reason why you go to them is because the Greco-Romans, they sacrifice their foods to idols, right? So you don't go to them, you go to Ishmael. And now you've converted and you're following this Jesus guy around. And they no longer think that you worship Yahweh. Are you getting your cuts of meat there any longer? Chances are you're not. And so now where do you go? Like, where do you go when your circle was already small because you were a Jew, and now it just got real small because you're a Christian who was formerly a Jew, now living, following Jesus Christ, the carpenter from Nazareth. Very difficult. So the pastor's writing to say, hey, Jesus is worth it. I know this is hard. I know this is difficult. I know, I know there's a cost here. But press forward. And so I think that's why the big theme of this letter is Christ is greater. And you're going to see this over and over again. There's things you want to go back to. But Christ is greater than those things. And there's nothing for you there anymore. And so you'll see this, like, how much more than kind of argument. If this was given to you in the Old Testament and Christ is greater than that, how much more important then is it for you to follow Jesus? It was already important for you to follow that thing back when you were a Jew and it was the Old Testament, but now that God has spoken through his Son, how much more important? So this theme, Christ is greater, we're going to see this over and over and over again. That's the big theme. The next big themes are the absolute supremacy of Christ in all things. Christ is just like, he's it. And he's worth following. And Gareth Cockerell says it like this. He says, Hebrews has a message for the people of God who live in a world that refuses to acknowledge God. So Hebrews has a message for the people of God who live in a world that refuses to acknowledge God. And that is, God has spoken. Which is pretty important. And so we talked about in our discussion, if this is true, what does that mean for us? What are the implications? And I think the big one is, you better listen, right? I made the example, like, there are certain voices in your life that when they speak, you should listen to them. Like your mothers, your teachers, your pastors. No, I mean, but there are just certain, like your spouse. Like, you're not supposed to just ignore your spouse, right? Like as a child, you're not supposed to ignore your parents. How much greater then, because God has spoken through his Son, are we supposed to listen? Okay, like I said, this is a 30,000 foot view, but I want to show you why we could spend 4 years on this book, okay? This is just the first 3 verses. All right, and so I'm just going to read it along, and we're going to just point out some small things. And I want you to see how this letter, homily, sermon is started. Because if the author, if the pastor who writes this is trying to say Christ is greater, notice how he starts. So he says, long ago, God spoke to our, first person plural, the pastors included with these people, our ancestors by the prophets. The word prophet there is just a fill-in for the whole Old Testament. At different times and in different ways. But in these last days, and that is a eschatological phrase, the last days, Joel uses it. Something's going to happen in the last days. And so the pastor knows what they're doing. They're pulling from prophetic language to say this last days have come. And so he used to speak to us through the prophets, and now he has spoken to us by his Son. Christ is the eschatological revelation, the thing we've been waiting for. The thing we've been waiting for this whole time wasn't a thing at all, actually. It was a person, and he came. And God has appointed him. He's appointed Jesus heir of all things and made the universe through him. So we have the pre-existence of Christ. So again, if we're building this argument that Christ is greater, right now we're saying, hey, God used to speak through the prophets, but now he has spoken through his Son who existed prior to creation because all things were created through him. The Son is the radiance, and that word radiance there, it's more than a reflection. He shares in the glory of the Father. So it's not a word that just means reflect. It's that there's this, his own internal ability to radiate of God's glory and the exact expression, and you might have imprint. It is a word that means like stamp or imprint. In other words, Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. So again, long ago, we spoke through the prophets. Now there's a Son who existed before all eternity, and everything was created through him. He shares in the glory of the Father, And he's the exact imprint of the God that you always worshiped, of Yahweh. You remember Yahweh? This is the exact imprint of him and of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification, and this is really fun, after making purification, in the Greek, there's a category of verb that we don't have in the English. So in the English, we have passive and active verbs. So you might say like, Nika hit the ball. That's an active verb. I did the action. A ball hit Nika. That became passive in that moment, Nika was hit by a ball. That's passive. So I received the action rather than doing the action, okay? In the Greek, they have what's called a middle. And sometimes the middle doesn't mean anything. It's just kind of in that form and it doesn't mean anything. But sometimes it can mean that the subject is the actor and the one acted upon. And that is what's happening here. It's an amazing thing. So Jesus makes purification. He's the one that does it, and he does it by laying down his life. Like, he is the purification as well as he does the purification. It's an absolutely bananas statement. It's so amazing. And so Jesus is both the one doing it for you and doing it on behalf of you. He makes purifications for our sins. That's the incarnation. He sat down. That's a very biblical phrase for finished work. When he's like, hey, we're done. It's over. Tetelestai, it's over. At the right hand, so the right hand is a phrase in the Bible. It typically means where all power resides. So you say, that's why when the sons of thunder, the mom comes up and she's like, can you grant that my son sit at your right hand? What they're asking for is to sit with power. And so on and on and on, he sits at the right hand of the majesty on high. I mean, we're 3 verses in. We're talking about incarnation, exaltation, pre-existence, shared glory. I mean, we're talking about purification of sin. Like, it's an unbelievable 3 verses. We haven't even gotten anywhere in this letter. But this is how the pastor starts the letter. God once spoke. Now, he's speaking through his son. Christ is the fulfillment of the Old Testament, is what this pastor is saying. He's moving the speaking forward. So there was silence for 400 years. Remember that? God is always speaking and moving on behalf of his people. But at the end of the Old Testament, if you remember, the Hebrew Old Testament ends in 2 Chronicles. And what happens at the end of that is they rebuild their temple because it had been broken by the Babylonians. They rebuild it. The young people rejoice when it's rebuilt. And the older people weep. And it's because the older people realize the Spirit of God did not come back down on the temple. And they know better. They remember. And so they have been waiting for God to speak again. And God has spoken again through his son. And the son is the pre-existent, incarnate, and exalted one. 3 verses. And this is what the pastor has said. It's unbelievable. Why might the pastor start this way? And I'll let you think about that. I'm not going to answer that. I kind of already have. But just take a moment. Why might the pastor start that way? So then after the end of verse 3, it then says, Christ is greater than the angels. And you're like, what? Like, we were just talking about like all this high Christology and God has spoken through the Son. And then all of a sudden verse 4 is like, yeah, so therefore Christ is greater than the angels. And you're going, what do angels have to do with everything he just said? Well, if you were a Jewish person in the first century, kind of like my Bud, Barry, and Bob comment, you would immediately know. You would just know. What angels have to do with what he just said is, long ago, when God spoke, angels are believed in Jewish literature to be the mediators of revelation. So when Moses is up on the mountain at Sinai and God's giving him the law, it is believed in Jewish literature that the angels bring it. Because they have this problem in Jewish culture. Like, how can an imperfect man receive from a perfect God something that we know Moses can't see God face to face? He has to be shoved in the cleft of the rock. Now, I'm fine with a little bit of mystery there, but I understand you're bored, you're sitting around, you're hanging out with your rabbi friends, and you're like, yeah, but how do they do that? I don't know how they do that. I don't know. So a really great solution, angels. They're not human and they are not God, so they make a pretty good mediator there. So this is why Christ is greater than the angels. The angels used to be the mediator. That's how God was able to speak to humanity, was he gave the angels the law and then they gave it to Moses. But Jesus doesn't need a mediator. He is the mediator. This is why Jesus is greater than angels, is he's not the go-between. He is the thing. He's the person. He's the Word of God come and indwelt among us. And so God also never told an angel, the author of this Hebrews letters, he never says, hey, you're my son. But he tells Jesus that in a really unique way. And we see this in Psalm 2:7 and 2 Samuel 7:14, which later we understand to be the greatest fulfillment of these passages. So God talks of David as if he's adopting him, but then he talks of his son as the only begotten one. They're begotten, not adopted, begotten, excuse me. So when Christ came into the world too, notice the angels rejoice, right? Christ is greater. We have all this evidence in the scriptures because the angels, now to be fair, angels are sometimes called sons of God, but that's just a phrase for the angelology. They're not called son. Like, you're not my child, in the way that God says that of David, and he says it in a more unique way of Jesus. And when Jesus comes in the world, the angels rejoice at his coming. So it tells you the hierarchy we see in the scriptures. So because of that, we have our first Hebrews warning passage. So one of the things that Hebrews is going to do in each of these units is they're going to talk about how Christ is greater than something, and then it's going to issue a warning, okay? And the warning kind of goes like this. Christ is greater. Remember this Old Testament thing? Christ is greater. So be warned, because if the Old Testament thing was important, how much more important is it then to follow Jesus? That's the pattern. And so we will see, like, when he says, hey, Christ is greater than the angels, and then he says, look, there was a consequence for disregarding the message of the angels. There's a consequence for disregarding the law. How then will we escape if we neglect such a great salvation that comes through the greater one, Christ? If there was a consequence for rebellion against the angels' revelation, and Christ is greater, how much greater is that cost of rebellion? This is an argument from lesser to greater that we're going to see throughout it. Now, these warning passages have created problems for people throughout the centuries. So just in general, how do we handle them? You're meant to be a little uncomfortable, okay? Like, you're meant to read that and be like, that's a really good point. Like, rebellion from the law had consequences. What would be the consequence for rebellion of the Son, right? You're meant to think that. And remember, though, that this is a pastor. He's not trying to scare or harm them. He's being provocative in order to provoke. These people are on the precipice of returning. And he's going, hey. So when you read this, don't think of it as like a modern person debating, once saved, always saved. What does this mean? Are we supposed to scare people? Should we scare people with the scriptures? No. You read it as, if I were a pastor trying to convince people the decision to return is life-altering, eternal-altering, what would I write? And when you get in that mindset, the warning passages actually speak really beautifully of a pastor who's desperate to keep people walking forward with Christ. So chapter 1, first 3 verses, unbelievably beautiful. Then we talk about how much greater we are than the angels, how unique Jesus is compared to the angels. And then chapter 2 ends really beautifully. It goes on, and because remember, this is a pastor, right? And he says, look, Jesus is better than the angels. That's chapter 1. But not only that, but Jesus became a human so that he might save humans, not angels. So this is how chapter 2 ends. It's so amazing. It says, Jesus, his concern is not for the angels, but he is concerned for Abraham's descendants. It's amazing, right? It starts with this massively high Christology of who Jesus is. And then it talks about Jesus is just so much greater than the angels. And so therefore, don't turn back. Don't go back to the mediation of the angels. Like, stay with the mediation of the Son. And by the way, not only is Christ greater than the angels, you're greater than the angels, because Christ didn't take on the form of an angel to save angels. He took on the form of a servant to save humanity. It's pretty rad. It's pretty amazing part of Hebrews. All right, this was a discussion question we had. So if Christ is greater than the angels, who were the mediators of the law, what does that mean for us? What does that mean about our relationship to the revelation of God? And the ultimate answer I was driving toward, I know this question tripped people up, but we've said this so many times at St. Jude. It's not controversial, but I have to be careful around this. Like, I don't want to offend people, but I love the Bible. I love the Bible. We're studying the Bible. We're literally studying the Bible together. So I think the Bible is radically important. But the center of our faith is not a book. It's not a law. It's not Hebrews. The center of our faith is a person. And he speaks through the Spirit, and not always audibly, but God speaks. And the center of our faith is a person, not a book. Okay, so what's our so what? God has spoken. What an unbelievable gift that the God of the universe would condescend to speak to us. We should listen. We should eagerly seek to listen. That's why we're studying Hebrews. This is part of the way that he has spoken. That the writers of the scriptures were carried along by the Spirit is what the scriptures say. Humans are greater than angels. Jesus came to save you. Rejoice in that. The law is good, and I mean that. So many people disparage the law. So like one of the big so whats is you are not going to hear this pastor disparage Judaism. They're not like, oh, the law, that was crummy. Jesus is good, so follow Jesus. Like, no, he's going to say, look, the law was good. There's this like anti-Semitism and so many parts of Western Christianity that just frankly is evil and it needs to go. The law is good. The scriptures say that. No, was it incomplete? Yes. Was it designed to be fulfilled and ultimately replaced by the new covenant? Yeah, of course. All of that's true. But it's good. It's good. But not as good as this ultimate supremacy of Jesus. If you want to know what God looks like, look at his imprint, which is Jesus. If you want to know what God's like, look at Jesus. He's the exact imprint of him. And that means if you want to know how you're supposed to live, be like God's imprint. That's what it means for us to be made in the image of God. All right. Next time, we are going to cover Moses in the Promised Land. Read Hebrews. Sit down and read through Hebrews. I think you'll find that it's incredibly rewarding. Grace and peace. If nobody's told you today that they love you, I do. Way more importantly, God does. Peace out, friends.